from it to two trail shots. Another leads down toward Caves Cove. One runs through the East Valley in North Carolina. Another takes off down Jenkins Ridge, also on the Carolina side. Once Dennis Martin lost his sense of direction, one of these trails probably looked pretty much like the others to him, and he went the wrong way. It's a tragic story, one of a little boy who simply became lost in the wilds of Appalachia. Not everybody who has studied events agrees with that.
Wait a minute.
Incoherent timelines, the presence of elite military units, FBI involvement,
hey, sweetie.
and tales of wild men living in the
I didn't put a timer on this bitch.
To an air of mystery which surrounds this case.
What's happening?
Which some might call
No, don't make me delete it.
411 disappearance. But before I talk to you about how Dennis Martin got lost in the wilderness, I want to tell you about how you can get lost.
5. There we go. 5 seconds delay. Oh, ghetto! I just turned it on, and you need my love. Okay. 1 moment.
Having worked in the marketing field prior to becoming a content creator, I worked in digital marketing, and I can tell you firsthand, because I had a lot of lists with a lot of people's names, addresses, phone numbers, whether they were on Medicare or not, all sorts of details that you would never really expect a random person sitting in an office somewhere to have. The way that we would get that information in the marketing world was by going and buying it from data brokers. Every time you enter a name, a date of birth, an email address, basically any little bit of information that could help somebody contact you and tell them what you may want or not want to buy, well, that information gets saved, stored, and then sold to somebody. That's a big reason why you're getting so many spam calls and emails clogging up your inboxes. And the biggest problem is that if you want to get all of that information off the web, if you want this to stop, you have to go and file claims with each and every one of hundreds of data brokers. And then those data brokers, what they're going to do is they're going to say, oh, sorry, we'll take it down.
Hello.
30 or 60-day process, and then 2 months later, it's right back up there because they took it down. They didn't get rid of it. Delete Me solves these issues by assigning actual people to your account.
Oh, am I frozen?
They have the information you give them.
Nope. All right.
You remove it from websites.
All right.
Basically, you give them the information you don't want out there. It's there. They can
I have my last Cthulhu right here.
No more filing requests.
And then we'll be on to something else.
If you'd like to give Delete Me a try, then you can go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code lorelodge.
Yes, we'll be listening to Lore Lodge tonight for our background noise.
DeleteMe.com/lorelodge and use code
because we're getting into the spooky season. Oh, finally, there the fuck it is.
It's really hard to for this thing. What I think I'm going to do is just do some things around my home. My brother wants me to buy a pink Cadillac, and I'm going to get a license plate that says Rich.
Good for you, girl. All right. Small operation. This is the new head going on here. Can anybody see anything? Absolutely fucking not. Oh, God. One day I'll have enough money for a proper everything, but tonight is not the
Great Smoky Mountains National Park was believed lost Saturday night. Dennis Martin continued. He and others have said Martin was an architect.
We back?
The family mentioned in the article on the 15th included Dennis, his brother Doug, his grandfather Clyde, and of course his dad, William Martin. And all of them were in the park for what had become an annual Martin family Father's Day camping trip. Based on reports from the time, it seems that these 4 Martins were not the only members of the family present on the trip, as articles refer to an Irma M. Delotier as a cousin and a member of the hiking party. And based on some other things that are said, the implication is there that there were multiple other Martin family members there. In any case, they're hiking in at Cades Cove on the 13th, as Martin took the Anthony Creek Trail south until it met the Russell Field Trail, about 1.5 miles in. And then they took that Russell Field Trail another 3.5 miles until they came out at Russell Field. They camped at Russell Field the night of the 13th, and then the next morning they headed out eastward about 2.5 miles on the Appalachian Trail until they came to Spencefield. Spencefield was at the time
anything is your problem.
Where the Anthony Creek and Eagle Creek trails meet the Appalachian Trail. This is a location that sits just under 5,000 feet in elevation, and it's where the Martin family chose to spend their second night. After settling in, William Martin, frequently referred to as Bill in both the newspapers and the documents, sat with some of the other adults. As the kids ran around amongst the bushes and trees that had begun to dot the ankle-high grassland of the former pasture. According to the National Park Service files on the case, Doug, Dennis, and 2 other children were playing near the top and parallel to the Anthony Creek trailhead, while the parents sat in a grassy spot to the southwest of the Anthony Creek trailhead. Now, it's hard to say exactly where these 2 groups of people were, due to the fact that in the last 55 years, the park has changed a little bit. Trails have been renamed, they might have moved around slightly, but the point is, these kids were never more than 300 yards away from the adults. According to the National Park Service chronological narrative of the case, sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon, Bill Martin lost sight of his sons and the 2 other boys atop the ridge, and after 3 to 5 minutes, he became concerned when Dennis failed to appear. Now, there's some confusion here regarding the papers and the reports. It's hard to tell exactly what happened, but it seems that Doug and the other 2 boys reappeared at some point, and Dennis did not. Bill called out for his younger son, and thinking that the boy may have tried to head back towards Russell Field, he walked westward along the Appalachian Trail as far as Little Falls, about 1 mile away, before he returned to Spence Field. He reportedly thought it possible that Dennis had returned to camp by this point, and while it's unclear whether Doug spoke to him before he went out to Little Bald or after that, we do know what Doug told him happened. Bill and his father Clyde had last seen the boys atop the ridge, and Doug explained to the men that all of the kids were trying to sneak around and play a trick on the grown-ups. According to the chronological narrative, Douglas and the 2 other boys went south and then west and came upon the adults, while Dennis went northwest, as it were, and intended to come upon the adults from a north to south direction. Now, that part would imply that Doug and the other boys came up before Bill went searching. Now that document, the chronological narrative, describes Spence Field as a grassy area running east and west on the main Great Smoky Ridge.
I'm just putting this squid on as the new head tonight. And then probably getting into some other things I have on the works. And tonight we are listening to episodes of Lore Lodge, which is missing people, unknown phenomenons, and generally spooky.
Then the 2 trails he was most likely to run into were the Anthony Creek Trail and the Appalachian Trail. And these 2 trails lead north and west, respectively. Bill and Clyde decided that the best course
You're
of
new to my
action
channel,
would be
this is
to
probably
split
going to be
up
the
and
most
cover both
boring
trails
live
at
stream
once.
where I just sit
Bill
here
heading west
and
towards
work on
Russell
stuff
Field,
and
while his
never really
father
talk
headed
much.
north back towards Cades Cove. Meanwhile, unaware that there was a missing child in the area, Cades Cove seasonal naturalist Terry Chilcote and his wife were checking out the Boat Mountain Road, which was closed to cars beyond where it had a junction
looks
with the
like,
Anthony
well,
Creek
it says
Trail.
8
A couple of
watching,
driven from
but
Walnut Creek Road
most of them are
turned
probably
around
bots.
and
I don't get too many people on my live stream because I, like I say, I'm pretty boring.
At 7:30 p.m.
I mostly just live stream when I craft, so I feel like people are watching me, therefore I feel like I need to be
However,
productive.
they were able to give Bill Martin a ride back down to Laurel Creek Road, where he stayed for only about 10 minutes before a ranger named Nielsen and drove him back up to Spence Field. Why he went down in the first place is really not addressed. In any case, once they arrived back up at the campsite, they interviewed people who had been in the area that day. And while they had everyone from fishermen to Boy Scouts who had been on the Appalachian Trail, the Anthony Creek Trail, the Eagle Creek Trail, the Jenkins Ridge Trail, none of them had seen Dennis. As all of this was going on, though, Clyde had managed to make it back down the trail, and around 8:30 in the evening, he alerted rangers that Dennis Martin was nowhere to be found. In fact, it seems likely that the reason Nielsen was even in the position to pick Bill up is because he was probably responding to that report. While rangers on scene collected what information they could, the dispatcher was hard at work notifying other park personnel that they were all to report to the Boat Mountain Trail at 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, as recorded by Ranger Dwight McCarter.
Just gonna type the legs to get them out of my way for a second. There we go. Alright, Have a good night.
Lost, a Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue, McCarter wrote of that first day, during which he was assigned to a 4-man search team, which ran into problems immediately as a result of the previous night's rain. McCarter said that 2.5 inches of rain had fallen overnight, which posed both technical and logistical issues for the search effort. The narrowness of a now very muddy Boat Mountain road created a bottleneck as trucks and jeeps attempted to get everybody up to the turnaround. And then that turnaround was still nearly 2 miles from the campsite through, again, a very muddy trail. In addition to the difficulties with getting personnel to the search area, the heavy rains also meant trouble for one of the Park Service's most useful yet finicky tools, bloodhounds. You see, a light rain can be helpful in dog searches because damp earth will hold a scent longer, but a downpour, especially on a slope, well, that's going to wash away any material carrying the scent as it flows downhill. But while the weather conditions weren't necessarily optimal for a search effort, McCarter was going to be part of an effort which would include the National Park Service Rangers and maintenance personnel, the Sevier and Blount County Rescue Squads, the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, and a smattering of other experienced individuals. Still, McCarter wasn't exactly hopeful, journaling his belief that the rainstorm is a major complication to the search, and worrying that there is a serious risk of exposure and hypothermia for the
one person.
If they were going to find Dennis,
I'm probably the only one person. I got a couple of conventions coming up, so I'm working on some of my monsters. These are my Cthulhu's. So I'm stitching a octopus head on a teddy bear. And then I'm probably going to work on some other things because I'm running out of time.
He simply hadn't heard anybody calling for him.
But
alternatively, it was possible that if he had not found a trail, he had at least found his way down into one of these drainages,
if you're doing my
and
live
that he may have tried to follow one of the creeks. So, on that first full day of the search, volunteer teams revisited the trails on foot and on horseback, while a Ranger Phillips walked
to the world's most boring live stream.
Had not been part of the previous day's effort, mostly because they felt like it was going in the wrong direction. The last time Dennis had been seen, he was on the Tennessee side of the ridge. In order for Dennis to get to the Eagle Creek Trail, it would have meant crossing back over the ridge, over the Appalachian Trail, and then going down past the actual trail shelter. In any case, as Phillips covered that side of things, 2 parties of volunteer riders covered the Anthony Creek and Leadbetter Ridge routes. Today, mapped is the Boat Mountain Trail and the Russell.
I am, but it's nice to say you.
Also
I'm not.
Here, it was a troop of Boy Scouts who had camped at Derrick Knob the night prior, 30 of whom walked west along the Appalachian Trail, while another 8 went south down the Jenkins Ridge Trail. With the marked paths covered, the more experienced men of the National Park Service and the rescue squads took the drainages at the west prong of Little River, Anthony Creek, Little Bald, and Spence Field. If Dennis wasn't on a trail, then the next easiest path would be for him to go downhill into one of these drainages. The problem was, these drainages were covered in, again, dense undergrowth, and it would be very difficult to conduct a full search without an immense amount of manpower. Thankfully,
I wish I had a better camera for a better angle, but
including
I
about
don't have
50
one.
Rangers in training who attended a junior college in Lake City, Florida, were in the area on a field trip. But more manpower came with its own set of problems, as Rangers were already struggling to get men and supplies up to the search area. They needed helicopters. To that end, the chronological narrative reports that Tony Stark, the Chief of Resource Management and Visitor Protection for the district...
Did he just say Tony Stark?
...was contacted and approval was obtained
oh my God.
to hire a helicopter to transport equipment
Imagine that having
to
that name
establish a base camp
before.
at Spence Field. The Park Service then acquired the services of a local private helicopter, and further efforts resulted in the dispatch of 2 Hueys from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Macon, Georgia. If I pronounced Macon wrong, you can tell me in the comments. I will not be offended, but you guys did spell it like bacon. Along with contributions by the Air National Guard, the military was able to offer more assistance
It was like teaching people how to spell Dartmouth in your mouth.
Or, as they are more formally known, U.S. Army Special Forces. According to the Park Service, a ranger by the name of Marion Myers contacted a U.S. Forest Service District Ranger on the Nantahala, who in turn made contact with Colonel Kinney, commanding the Special Forces troops in that area. This aspect of the search is commonly referenced by those who believe that the government, in some form or another, is hiding something about the Dennis Martin case, and that actually includes us in previous videos. However, there is some relevant context here as to why the Green Berets got involved in the first place. The way this breaks down is that Kinney was running a training exercise nearby, and when contacted, he was able to obtain permission from the 3rd Army headquarters at Fort Benning in Georgia to transfer 40 Green Berets, who are typically based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, into the search area.
Down.
It should
See how you're looking.
be noted that these forts underwent name changes in 2023, but I did not think that anybody watching this video in 2024 would recognize the names Fort Moore or Fort Liberty, partially because I sure didn't. The point is, the Green Berets were not just randomly called in from Fort Bragg, because there were 500 of them already training in the nearby Nantahala Gorge, only 17 miles to the southeast of Spencefield. It was, after all, the height of the Vietnam War, so this is not really all that surprising. All of that said, however, I do still have some thoughts on the activities of the Green Berets, but I'll get into that later. But with so much military involvement, which would actually grow to include multiple Army and Air National Guard units, a liaison was established at McGee Tyson Air Force Base. The way this would work was that the National Park Service would run the search from the park itself.
That'll be for the next one. That's an idea. Because if I can just make the legs,
they would contact the liaison,
then maybe I can just put the head back on after I take it off, or stitches the tentacles into the neck.
By Monday the 16th, at which
Something
point,
like that.
rescue squads were arriving from Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Georgia, and these were joining the Sevier County, Blount County, and North Carolina rescue squads that were already active in the area. And this sort of rush of rescue squads came after Hugh Trotter of Sevierville, the president of the Tennessee Association of Rescue Squads, met with National Park Service staff personnel and planned to organize the rescue squad effort to a larger scale. Now, to give you an idea of what a larger scale looks like, this was to be an increase from what was already some 100 persons officially listed as members of the search party that morning, according to an article.
My relationship with credit was not the greatest. With that yes to credit from Capital One and making payments on time, I was able to get a car loan. Having my car helps me be available to my loved ones.
Yep. Very, very corny.
What brings them to the Dudes Club is
I make a lot of weird
It's a
things.
safe and secure place for
Cthulhu's,
them to gather,
Stash
to see another
Bears,
brother not being
monsters.
afraid, because when they open up, the dudes are there.
Hi everyone,
They're ready.
my name is Grant Barton.
Persons officially
Now I gotta
listed
take
as
these
members of the
ears
search
out
party
and
that
put
morning,
them
according to an
on.
article written by Carson Brewer for the New Sentinel. Also included with that article were some more details
Sometimes
about
all you need
Dennis,
is
who was
violence.
described by his father as quiet and the type who wouldn't yell for help, though Bill Martin believed his son would answer if called. In any case, by the end of the day, the search force had climbed to about 300 men, consisting of National Park Service Rangers, rescue squads, Air National Guard, Green Berets, volunteers, and student foresters, all of this being supported by the American Red Cross. By the time the sun rose on the morning of Tuesday the 17th, Spence Field looked more like an army encampment than a search force, with the Red Cross ferrying food donations in from local restaurants, farmers, merchants, and individuals. I remember one article noted that a couple of teenage girls woke up really early one morning of the search to make 350 sandwiches that they then brought into the search area. When I looked through this, what really struck me was the way that the community came together to look for this kid. I mean, you had hundreds of people involved in the search within the first couple of days, but the overall effort involved thousands of people. There was one article where a guy who was from the Cades Cove area said something along the lines of, when one person's in trouble in the Cove, we all are. That is one of the uplifting parts about reading through most of these cases, is generally when a kid goes missing, we don't see people being like, oh, that's so unfortunate. Most of the time, I'm seeing that hundreds, if not thousands of people came together to support the search. Like, when kids go missing in these stories, it's heartwarming to see how much people care, which I have to say is pretty helpful given the fact that I read about a new tragedy each week for my job. But to get back to the search and away from my little sentimental moment here, Ranger Foster led the 50 student rangers in a grid search at Spence Field, looking closely for any missed signs that might give a hint as to the direction in which Dennis had moved. On the trails, the search continued and extended out of probable areas into possible areas, the National Park Service report noting that all possibilities were checked as manpower was available. It also detailed that the Anthony Creek and other Spencefield drainages were covered and recovered as they were every day, and that another heli spot was established at Russell Field. That same morning, the 17th, 2 Air Force HH-53 Jolly Green Giant helicopters
Jolly
ferried
Green
an
Giant
additional
helicopters.
50
Ho, ho,
Tennessee
ho,
Air National
Green
Guards into
Giant.
the grid search area at Spence Field because
The brain
Rangers
does
still
weird
believed
things.
Dennis was nearby. In fact, the majority of the search
Ghetto?
area here was concentrated to a 1-mile radius around where the boy was last seen. And you may be wondering
I
how,
brought him some feathers
on the third
today,
full day
so...
of the search, they could still think that
I brought the
Dennis
dog
was
some
there.
feathers, but he also
The
plays
answer
with
is
them.
that this is a really dense area, and even if Dennis
Jesus Christ,
weren't
I've never heard
alive,
him jump like
they
that.
still would rather find him than just leave him out there. Chief Ranger Lee Snedden told reporters that he felt the boy's range would not be more than a mile through the wooded area and not more than
Cannot
3
describe what I'm
miles on the
hearing
trail.
from upstairs.
Dennis's family wasn't so sure. His aunt Irma telling reporters that the boy's got energy, plus he led the way all the time on the hike. While Bill said that Dennis was a fast walker who hardly knows when to stop. Bill thought it was most likely, according to the chronological narrative, that Dennis was somewhere in either the Anthony Creek or Eagle Creek drainages, which included the nearest creeks to where the child was last seen. There were, however, other factors that were beginning to influence Mr. Martin's beliefs, as the National Park Service files make note that the first of many predictions by individuals, clairvoyants, and others began to come in that day.
I think you're going already.
These predictions, the document reads, played a definite part in this search and will be dealt with in an appendix to follow the narrative.
Appendix? That appendix first! Ah, finally.
As it turns out, over the course of the search, the Martins, as well as the National Park Service itself, received quite a few tips from people who referred to themselves as psychic mediums. All of these tips were considered as leads, though with varying degrees of sincerity. Mr. Martin, the chronological narrative reads, feels that some people do have the ability to see or predict things, which FBI files say resulted in almost daily contact with the Knoxville FBI office about psychic predictions.
We had a
The
lot of
FBI
psychic
just
predictions
discounted
here
psychic
when
predictions
Zach
out of hand,
disappeared,
but
and they all
the
said the same
National Park
thing.
Service felt that their hands were
He's
a
in the
little
water.
behind.
And there's a lighthouse
Public
nearby.
opinion was that they should follow every lead possible, and according to the public,
Doesn't
psychic
help
tips
because
were
where he
leads.
is, there's
So
no
the Park
lighthouses.
Service had
There's
to
water.
follow up on these, but
So
a
who
later
knows?
review of the case implies that they had something of a negative opinion on the matter. Many hours were spent to no
It's nice
avail in the
and thick.
Martin search, checking out visions of seers.
Just
the
squish
review
the brains
reads,
back in.
adding it might be well to make a note with the family regarding such individuals. If parents do not want anything to do with psychic leads, it continues, we can send them on their way and not waste time checking out their predictions. One of the listed examples came from a rather famous psychic medium of the era, Jeanne Dixon, who in 1956 made a prediction that a Democrat would win the presidency and die in office, which of course did happen. In Dennis's case, Jan said the boy went out on level ground, went down an incline, and turned off to the left at a 40 to 50 degree angle and up a little, then went back down and would be underneath the point of the incline. The area where he turned left has shrubbery and is thickety. Did not see any trees where he veered off to the left, more or less bare ground. Another example was the prediction of a man named Harold Sherman, a California psychic, who said that Dennis will be found 24 miles to the left of where he was last seen by his father or brother. Fell off a steep cliff, hung up in the bushes. And in both this and the Dixon prediction, it seems that left refers to the cardinal direction west.
Haha, freebie. That's a cute one. I can't believe you did that.
And in both this and the Dixon prediction, it seems that left refers to the cardinal direction west. Why they don't just say west, I don't know. Also, there's a stunning amount of times that I have covered cases from this area where instead of saying west, they say left. By that I mean 3. The third example came from a man named Jeffrey Owens, who was actually a local from Gatlinburg, and he said he had dreams for the last 2 nights about a lost boy. He said that in dreams he is not very far from where lost. Night before last I saw him lying on a hill behind a log, but last night I dreamed he had dragged himself down to the river for water. The report goes on to note that there were numerous other predictions, and the family was most receptive to these. However, none of these leads actually turned up any actionable info about Dennis, which isn't particularly surprising when you dig into them. Jeanne's prediction mostly just gave information that was already published in the papers. such as Dennis being on level ground, turning left at a 40 to 50 degree angle, or in his case going northwest, and going down an incline. It had been reported for several days that Dennis got lost on top of a ridge. There was really the only option was to go down. From where he disappeared, the remainder of her description would apply to basically any spot along the Appalachian Trail for miles in either direction, and for most trails nearby. Harold Sherman's prediction that he was 24 miles to the left, again, if we assume
thanks, Jason.
west,
You have a good night.
Dennis outside the park, and possibly across the Little Tennessee River. Even if Dennis were still in the park and
Thanks
somehow
for
24
believing
miles
in me.
west, maybe along trails, or I mean, if we're just talking about foot miles where he actually walked, which again he wasn't on the trails, so
Bye.
a little difficult to use now, isn't it? Anyway, the point is that the description of fell off a steep place, hung up in the bushes, is utterly useless considering the number of ridges and bushes in the park. In the case of Mr. Owens, we see much the same issue that we have with the preceding two, which is that it's just too vague to be useful. Saying that Dennis was lying on a hill behind a log one night and that he had dragged himself down to the river wasn't helpful because the searchers had already been checking drainages. So if he was down at the river or the side of the creek, he should have been found. The specifics of the other psychic recommendations aren't given in any of the National Park Service reports, but they do emphasize that all leads were checked and rechecked to no avail. Honestly,
Nobody can see what I'm doing.
To no avail.
I'm not sure if anybody wants to see what I'm doing. I'm just trying to stitch this ear
As
in.
that's essentially what happened over the next 2 weeks as more searchers, supplies, and helicopters joined the effort, only to find nothing. The search effort was expanding day by day, those involved moving farther and farther away from the point where Dennis was last seen. Except for the Green Berets, who kind of stayed in the same general area the entire time that they were there. Beginning their first full day on the search, Tuesday the 17th, Special Forces were assigned to the Eagle Creek and Jenkins Ridge Trail area, which had been searched for the first time on Sunday the 15th by Ranger Phillips. On the 17th, the News Sentinel reported, searchers found small footprints which could be those of Dennis Martin. The article, published on the 18th, reports that a search party which included James Harmon and Ronald Lauter, Ronald Lauter probably, found the set of prints yesterday afternoon about a mile down the Eagle Creek area from Spence Field. Speaking to the Tennessean, Harmon said that they found footprints, one shoe on and one shoe off, about 2:30 in the afternoon, but lost them in a branch that feeds into Eagle Creek after about 300 yards. Park officials reportedly didn't pay this discovery much mind because a number of Boy Scouts had been in that area, and they believed that the prints could easily just belong to one of them. Thing is, Lauder said that it was a single set of footprints headed downstream. What's more interesting to me than the Park Service reportedly not taking an interest is the fact that the prints actually don't appear in the chronological narrative at all. And that's especially weird for a couple of reasons, one of which is that this print discovery was reported multiple times, for like 3 days in a row, and at no point did the Park Service correct them and say, no, there weren't actually prints found. The Park Service just kind of let them report that, and then didn't report it themselves. The other reason it's a little weird is that that's not even the first set of tracks reported by the papers. Articles published on the 17th in both the Tennessean and the News Sentinel mentioned that tracks were found Monday afternoon, prior to the arrival of the Green Berets. These tracks failed to produce the boy, according to the Tennessean, while the other paper claimed that the prints proved to be the wrong size for the boy. But neither paper says where the tracks were. While I can't say for certain, I do wonder if Harmon and Lauder found the tracks Monday, but shoddy reporting made it seem like they found them Tuesday. And this is partially due to the fact that we know Special Forces were in the area on Tuesday, according to the chronological narrative. And if there were Special Forces there, you would assume then that the volunteers would not be in the area. It's all a little weird, though obviously there's no smoking gun here. But it is weird enough to take a closer look at the actions of the Green Berets and the National Park Service over the next several days. As the Park Service apparently downplayed the prints, Special Forces A teams continued to check the Eagle Creek area on the 18th, with nearly 24 additional Green Berets brought in that day, for a total of 62. This brought the total search force to 615 people, which now also included students from the University of Tennessee's forestry program, as well as both Air and Army National Guard units. What's interesting is that while 90% of the search force were exploring progressively wider ranges of the park, mostly to the east and west along the Appalachian Trail, the Green Berets were just looking in a very specific area. On the 17th, they were deployed to Eagle Creek, where those tracks were found, and then they returned to that same location the following day. On the 19th, the chronological narrative reports that they began to concentrate on an area between Forester Ridge and Jenkins Trail below Hog Gap, on the other side of a ridge from and southeast of Eagle Creek. Now, I have no proof that they were doing this, but it does kind of seem like they were following some kind of trail up Eagle Creek, over Hog Gap, and then down into the Hog Gap branch area, which is part of a drainage that leads into Hazel Creek. And this also happened to coincide with the advice of a psychic out of Michigan by the name of Mrs. Schwaller, who said that Dennis would be found 5 miles southeast from the area where he was last seen, and that he would be on a stream by a waterfall and in an area covered by white pine trees. That could have been a lucky guess, as along a stream in an area with white pines would describe a lot of places in the Smokies, but the 5 miles southeast is interesting. The reason it's interesting is that the location in which the Green Berets were searching on the 19th had not yet been made public by the time this tip was submitted. And this was a tip that would put Dennis either along the Bone Valley Creek or Hog Gap Branch.
Bone Valley.
Still,
That's the name of
her
a place.
predicting there would be a waterfall, because there are no waterfalls mapped along that waterway.
Probably
So,
not a
in this
waterfall, but
case,
probably like a
I'm
waterfall,
still gonna
like
err on the
that
side of
big.
random
Just like a
chance.
waterfall,
Now, what
not
wasn't
a
random chance,
waterfall.
at least so far as I can tell, was the decision by Special Forces to set up a helicopter landing zone atop Hog Gap on the 20th, especially in light of what occurred that night. Around 8 p.m. on the evening of Friday, the 20th of June, 1969, the Green Berets met with National Park Service personnel for a strategy meeting, in which they formulated 2 plans based upon whether Dennis was found alive
Alrighty.
or not.
Little
The
hairy,
first
but I
step, of
think he's
course, would
done.
be to determine if he was alive, with the criteria being that he was only dead if rigor mortis has set in, which seems weird, but at the same time, they could have been worried about hypothermia mimicking death. From there, they were to notify the chief ranger by the most expeditious means possible with the location and status of the boy. They were then to climb a tree and set a flag, build a smudge fire, use a smoke bomb, military only, or use another signal for a helicopter. If Dennis was found alive, they were instructed to stand by while Special Forces repel a man in by helicopter and secure the boy in a litter. Or, should the worst come to pass, they were to guard the area until they were relieved by Chief Ranger Sneddon. Finally, they were ordered to obtain the name and address of whoever found Dennis, presumably so that person could be interviewed, whether they were a National Park, Green Beret, or just a volunteer. Now, the way all of that reads, it sounds almost like they were expecting to find Dennis within the next couple of days, and that they expected whoever was going to find the boy to be either a park ranger or a Green Beret. And all of that put together would suggest that they expected to find Dennis off trail. This is all made even more interesting by the fact that in the National Park Service chronological narrative, the 21st is the very first time that the actions of the Green Berets are not detailed, for the first time since they arrived in the park. Instead, we're informed that a roadblock was set up at the Townsend Y at 5 a.m. The Y is not a YMCA, it's a geographical Y, with Blount County Sheriff's deputies and rescue squad personnel assisting, and the intention being to keep the area clear of non-approved onlookers. We're also told that rangers screened searches and loaded those approved onto buses, and after all the high spots were perfectly staffed, the remaining searchers were directed to the drainages and ridges along Anthony Creek, All Night Ridge, Leadbetter Ridge, and the immediate drainages
You
to
went there
Kings
too.
Cove. And with some 1,400 searchers out that day, they completely saturated a 1-mile radius around Spence Field and all immediate logical ridge tops. Finally, the report states that all local drainages had been covered 250 feet up on each side of the streams, and the farthest this would have taken any volunteer was Eagle Creek, and most volunteers were on the Tennessee side anyway, well away from Special Forces. And then the 22nd came and went without any mention of the activities of the Green Berets, aside from the addition of another 9 members of the elite military unit, bringing the total to 71 commandos.
71
Whatever the
Green
reason for
Berets.
bringing in more Green Berets was, it's not recorded in any of the files for that day. Nor are there actions in the reports for the 23rd or the 24th, which is the day that FBI agent Jim Reich came in for a conference. What the outcome of that meeting was is not recorded, nor was anything about the Green Berets aside from their departure. which spanned the 25th and the 26th in groups of 33 and 38 respectively. The 25th was also the day that Park Superintendent Fry issued a press release stating that the operation will be greatly reduced as of June 26, 1969, and that the 75 National Park Service personnel now on the search will continue through Sunday. If the boy is not found by this time, the report continues, the search will continue on a limited basis for up to 60 days. All Tennessee Army National Guard troops will leave today. Somewhat predictably, this decision was not received well by the Martin family, and in particular, Bill Martin, who was of the mind that his son was not just lost, but had in fact been kidnapped. The search, of course, continued a few more days, and then on the evening of the 29th, a meeting was held at the Cades Cove Operations Center with Mr. and Mrs. William Martin, FBI agent Jim Wright, Chief Ranger Snedden, District Ranger Morris, and Sub-District Ranger Nielsen to discuss where to go from that point. Reich apparently argued that, absent evidence of a kidnapping, the FBI could not launch a full investigation into the whereabouts of Dennis Martin. Bill, on the other hand, felt that the short time between the last time he saw Dennis and when they began looking, and the fact that Dennis was not near Spence Field, indicated he didn't just wander off. In essence, while there was no evidence of a kidnapping, the existing evidence didn't support the notion that Dennis could have just left the area that quickly either. Nonetheless, the FBI said they had no reason to get involved. The National Park Service was only willing to offer 3 rangers on a search for the next 60 days, though those rangers would be able and willing to coordinate volunteers. With that, the search was suspended on the evening of the 29th, with no trace of Dennis Martin ever reportedly found. However, less than a month later, a very strange report was coming from a Mr. Harold Key. To go over that side of things, I decided to bring in a man who is much better versed in that aspect of business than I am, and a man who deserves a lot more recognition for the incredible work that he does over on his channel, The Missing Enigma.
This club is by and for the men. The Dudes Club is a brotherhood for men's health and is a safe place for men to come together and share things that are happening in life and feel safe.
I don't know where all my shit is!
Small business owners know that sometimes things just
Black
go together.
paint! Where is the black
Like a
paint?
cappuccino and biscotti. Software and hardware. Hammer and nails. And what goes together with your small business needs? A TD Small Business Account Manager. They have in-depth business banking expertise.
Red intestines it is.
The advice and resources you need, making your day-to-day easier. So if you're ready to meet your small business match, we're ready for you.
Hey there, folks. You might recognize me, but maybe you don't. I'm Nick from the Missing Enigma channel. I've spent a lot of time working on the Dennis Martin case, and I've released a lot of videos on the subject. So I want to thank the Lore Lodge for allowing me to do this segment discussing an important figure, Michael Bouchard. A man I've spent many hours talking to about the Martin
What's
case.
up, Ghetto? You're
Now,
just sitting there
Mike
looking at
wasn't
me.
directly involved in the
Judging
search.
me silently.
He's an author and a police officer from Connecticut who likes to spend his free time
Get you wet food, I got you dry food.
cold cases. His work has really added a lot to our current understanding of the Dennis Martin case. I was fortunate enough to run into his name after hearing him mentioned by Dwight McCarter, another important Dennis Martin figure. After looking Bouchard up, I discovered he had written a book about this thick called The Disappearance of Dennis Martin, which compiled a multi-year investigation
it's
into
lovely.
the incident. That
I
book
need
was
some
released back
darker
in
colors, though.
2021, but he's a self-published man who doesn't really advertise his work, so the importance of that little book didn't disseminate right away. At that point, my own perspective on the Dennis Martin case had changed dramatically by reading the official NPS report.
Why aren't you trying
But after reading Bouchard's book, it changed again. Why? Because it gives clarity to what had been one of the most mysterious and pivotal events during the Martin disappearance, that being the Harold Key sighting. Now, up until the point that Bouchard published his book, the Key sighting was believed by most people to have gone something like this. Harold Key and his family stop by Rowan's Creek and walk out into the woods in hopes of seeing a bear. After walking a ways, they heard an enormous, sickening scream. A few minutes later, Mr. Key saw a rough-looking man moving stealthily through the woods in an area where the scream was heard. This sighting would get expanded upon with the release of Missing 411 in 2011, where author David Paulides writes that Dennis Martin's father told him that the man Mr. Key saw in the woods was a dark figure running along a ridgeline and carrying something on his shoulder. Naturally, people interpreted that the figure may have been carrying young Dennis. Sprinkle in some legends of wild men in the Smokies, and you get Dennis Martin being abducted by a wild man, or in some cases even Bigfoot. The problem with this whole interpretation of the sighting is that there was no modern-day interview with Mr. Key, the man whose sighting was so pivotal. I mean, he was the one who was there, so it seems like he would be the most important individual to talk to about what he saw that day. Thankfully, that is what Michael Bouchard gave us when he interviewed Harold Key on July 27th of 2016. Up until that point, Harold Key had not spoken about the case since he was initially interviewed back in 1969, and obviously since that time, the Dennis Martin story had really developed a lot of legend or mythology around it. Mr. Key told Michael Bouchard that he took his family out to Rowan's Creek to look for some wild hogs or bears. He couldn't remember the exact time of the incident, but believed it was somewhere between 2 and 7 p.m. Before walking out into the woods, he noticed an unoccupied white vehicle parked along the road. At the time, he paid little attention to it. He then walked about 200 to 300 yards into the woods and saw a white, middle-aged man that was dirty and disheveled and walking quickly through the brush towards the road. When the man saw Mr. Key and his family, he started to walk faster. Mr. Key told Bouchard
What did I do with the red paint?
sweating heavily and acting nervous.
Are you kidding me?
The man made it to the road, entered the white vehicle,
I get him.
and drove off at a high rate of speed, spitting gravel into the air. Mr. Key was directly quoted saying, "I only saw one man in the woods, the man who walked out of the woods and got into the white car." As Mr. Key continued on towards Rowan's Creek, he heard a child scream the word help, and then he heard an agonizing scream of pain. Mr. Key then hurried up the path another 200 yards,
There we go.
but he didn't see a child. To him, it seemed that the scream had come from a great distance, but he could not pinpoint the exact location. Harold Key's daughter, Wanda Key Grandstaff, was present for the event, and she was also interviewed by Michael Bouchard. She took issue with the idea that her father ever saw a man in the woods carrying a child. She said her father was a World War II vet, and if he saw someone hurting a child, he would go after the man.
Hey,
The
what are
idea
you
that
doing?
people believed her father saw someone carrying a child and simply did nothing seemed to really irritate her. She had also seen newspapers saying that her brothers were out walking ahead of their father and saw something, but she wanted to correct that record as well, saying that neither boy saw anyone, and they were all walking behind Mr. Key looking for rocks and sticks along the trail.
All right.
One of her brothers did
Come
hear
here.
a scream,
Come here.
but
You
couldn't
need
tell if
snuggles?
it was an animal or a
Oh,
child.
there's a baby.
After this experience,
Hang
the
on.
family left
Somebody
the
needs
park
some
and went
lovin's.
back home, but Harold Key didn't make the connection in his head until he
Do
learned
I
of the
need a
disappearance of
bucket
Dennis
for you?
Martin.
I know
At
what
that
I need
point,
to get you. I
he
need to
realized
get you a
what he had
cardboard
seen
box.
may have some bearing
And I
on
can
the
put it on the
case.
table, and
He got
that'll
in
be
touch with
your box,
authorities
and we'll
and
put a
was
nice little
interviewed at
soft
his home
blanket
by
in it.
FBI
And then
agents
you can be
Jim
close
Wright
to me
and Wallace
without
Estel.
being in danger
The
of
agents
like the
told
hot
Mr. Key
things
to
or the
not
sharp
talk about
things
the
or the
incident
pokey
with
things.
anyone. This is relevant
That sound good?
because Mr. Key did talk about it.
Let me
He
see your
talked to
ear.
reporters, and those interviews were published. Mr. Key reported to Bouchard that one night he received an anonymous phone call at home, and the person on the other line said, "It's none of your damn business about the missing boy, and don't talk about it." Something quite similar to what the FBI agents told
Yeah,
him.
baby.
Mr. Key would provide a second interview to the FBI, this time on location at Rowan's Creek. He was intercepted by the FBI on the way to that location and then taken there, a story that is sometimes blown out of proportion. Dennis Martin's father, Bill, was not invited to attend this important meeting where Mr. Key showed the FBI
baby.
and the NPS.
We're having a little
exactly
kitty
what
break.
he saw
Somebody
and
needs some
where he
attention
saw
and
it.
some loving.
This meeting
So.
was later documented and released in the FBI files.
All right.
2 years
Are you good
after
for a
the
minute?
Dennis Martin
Can I get
disappearance,
back to work? And
Harold Key received
finish
another
something tonight?
anonymous phone call. This time, the person on the other line said, "The case is closed. Forget what you've heard." After that, Mr. Key didn't talk about the incident again until he spoke with Michael Bouchard in 2016. And he said the only reason he was willing to talk about the incident then was because most of the people involved in the investigation, including both FBI agents, were already dead. Mr. Key himself was 92 years old and figured there was nothing they could do to him at that point, and he's not wrong. When asked about his thoughts on the Dennis Martin disappearance, Mr. Key said that at the bottom of his heart, he believed that the boy was killed and his body was disposed of in the woods. So that is the full story of Harold Key's sighting as told by the man himself. I'm sure that some people who heard the story told differently might say, well, why should I believe this Bouchard guy? It's a fair question to ask, and I felt similarly, but I've interviewed the man twice on my channel and have talked to him for countless hours on the phone. He engrossed himself in this case. He knows everything about the incident down to the smallest detail. I found him to be reliable, thorough, and trustworthy. But, in addition to all that, I did find contemporary newspaper articles that confirm much of what Mr. Key told Bouchard. These articles contain interviews with Mr. Key where he specifically mentions the man and the white car. No interview with Mr. Key, either modern or contemporary, ever has him on record saying that the man he saw was carrying anything on his shoulder. And beyond the Harold Key interview, Bouchard was able to put additional myths to bed, one important one being the death of FBI agent Jim Reich. The myth about Jim Reich was that he was so distressed about what he had seen or learned as it relates to the Dennis Martin case that he decided to end his own life. The latter part of that is true, but there is no evidence that he took that action due to the Dennis Martin case. Bouchard spoke with Jim Reich's son and quickly discovered that Dennis Martin had nothing to do with it. Like many people, Jim Reich had issues with mental health and substance abuse. In addition to that, Jim Reich was only one of 2 FBI agents involved in the Martin disappearance. The other, Wallace Estell, would retire and go on living his life. So, like many mysteries in the world, over time, our understanding of them changes as new information comes out. With Dennis Martin, so much was written when it occurred back in 1969. It was a huge story, but over time it faded out of the public consciousness. It was revived once again when Missing 411 The Eastern U.S. was released back in 2011. With this came a story from Bill Martin saying that he spoke to Harold Key and Mr. Key told him he saw a man in the woods carrying something on his shoulder. This key point, among many others, would contribute to the Dennis Martin case becoming a well-known mystery and disappearance. Then, in 2021, Michael Bouchard releases his book, An Interview with Harold Key himself, where he clarifies the inaccuracies that had been told about his story for so many years. I think this information certainly helped correct the record, as there is absolutely no documented interview with Mr. Key where he says he saw a man carrying a child or anything at all. Some rightly ask, why then would Bill Martin tell such a story to David Paulides? Obviously, I can't answer this definitively, but sometimes the disappearance of a child can have such a detrimental effect on a parent or a family member that they will create any scenario in their minds that allows for their child to still be alive. This in turn can sometimes keep hope alive. Hope that their child is still out there somewhere, living some kind of life. But that is just my theory on the subject. Ultimately, I really only care about the interviews Harold Key did, which were back in 1969 and then again in 2016 with Michael Bouchard. It really is lucky because Mr. Key would pass away just a few years later. So that's the story of Michael Bouchard and his involvement in the Dennis Martin case. Thanks to his investigative work, we have new information to work with as we all attempt to create ideas and theories about what could have happened on that fateful day back in June of 1969. Now, I'll thank you for listening and throw it back to Aiden.
Mountain Cold Refreshment. The chill choice.
Speaking of theories, I mentioned that I had some thoughts on what was going on with the Green Berets, and I think that now might be the time to share them. You know, when I first heard about Missing 411, I believe it came through Mr. Ballin, and the part that, the story that really got me intrigued was this one. It was the Dennis Martin disappearance, which I think we've actually, in various ways covered 3 different times now. The reason it was so interesting to me, however, was the Green Beret involvement. And at first, it was the fact that there were Green Berets involved at all, because that's a pretty elite military unit. Why are you calling them in for a missing 7-year-old? Of course, the fact that they were just training nearby kind of explains that part. When I covered it a second time, I was intrigued by the fact that the Green Berets seemed to be working separately from the National Park Service, because they weren't using the same communications, they weren't involved in the same areas of the search. But
I'm not getting
as
any
I
more
thought about it
sweets.
more, and as some people
just had a bunch of
wrote
treats.
suggestions in the comments, you know, it made sense that they are a special forces group, they have their own way of doing things, and maybe they just didn't gel with the way the Park Service is handling things. But upon reviewing the case a third time, it still strikes me as odd that the Green Berets were operating in this very limited area with what appeared to be some intention. You know, it wasn't just that they wouldn't be useful anywhere else. These guys work in teams of 10 to 12. Those teams of 10 to 12 are totally self-sufficient on their own, and they could have been distributed all over the park. So why have all of them in one spot? And the truth is, it wouldn't really feel like anything if not for the footprints, and how weird the Park Service was about the footprints. And while this is reported in the newspapers, it's not in the actual chronological narrative. And again, I would just assume the newspapers made an oopsie if it hadn't then been reiterated in the newspapers for several days with no correction. And then we have the fact that these footprints that were apparently nothing to think about are the starting point of the Green Berets moving eastward along these ridges and then down into the Haw Gap Branch. So when I look at it, it really does look to me like those footprints were found and the Green Berets were the guys assigned to follow them. That could be entirely not the case. Like, I can't prove that. I don't think that it's... There is no way for me to prove that, ever. Basically, the only way this could be proven is if you could find the orders to the Green Berets there that are saying, hey, follow the footprints. But of course, it was never reported that Dennis Martin was found. In fact, precisely the opposite was reported. Even though these Green Berets just go this direction, make a plan for what to do when they find Dennis, and then suddenly disappear. And then we're just told a few days later, he was never found. So maybe he wasn't found, but in that case, what were the Green Berets following? What were they tracking? How did they end up over there? I don't want to sound like David Paulides and tell you imply to you that this is Bigfoot or feral people or something like that, but it's weird. But the thing is, that's not the only thing about this case that's weird, and it's not necessarily connected to the other things that are weird. I mean, as Nick said, Harold Key got weird calls months and then years after he reported what he saw, telling him, you know, the case is closed, drop it, don't talk about it. We also know that the FBI did open an investigation into Dennis Martin, and that a couple of years later, that case was closed with really no information made public. And to be honest, as I was doing the research for this, it became very clear to me that I was not going to be able to get through all of the theories, all the conspiracies, all that stuff in this video. Realistically, in the week that I had to research and write this video. So to that end, there's going to be a part 2, and the part 2, much like what we did with Dyatlov Pass and with MH370, things like that, is going to go into the conspiracies and the evidence for and against each other. But of course, I need several more days to put that together, so that one will be coming out after this one. If you're watching this the Friday it premiered, then this will be a week later. If you're watching this anytime after August 23rd, 2024, then the second video is already up. So, just part 2. It should be up. Go find it. It might be in the description. I don't know if I remember. But with all of that said, I first of all want to thank Nick for his contribution to this video, because I definitely didn't have time to write that part myself, and he did a better job than I would have. Nick's channel, The Missing Enigma, has so much good work on it. The man is not only a great storyteller, but also a fantastic researcher, and he makes some really incredible drawings to go along with his cases. We've had him on our channel as a guest on the podcast numerous times. He has always made me think. He has, in fact, changed my mind on the Charles McCuller disappearance. So I cannot recommend Nick's channel highly enough. The Missing Enigma is one of my favorite channels on YouTube, and you guys, if you like what we do, you will absolutely love what he does too. So if you'd like to support him, obviously watch his videos and get to a point where he can go full time with YouTube. And if you want to support us, as we are currently full-time here on YouTube, you can subscribe to this channel, of course. You can share the video. You can hit that like button.
Somebody's gonna live to a peanut butter jar.
If you didn't like the video, I'm surprised you're still here, but, you know, I get it. Or if you want to support us in a more direct way, we have a few ways you can do that. First of all, on Discord, password, where we have updates for everything.
It's green.
That is bit.ly/joinTheLodge. That will get you to a link to join.
Alright.
After
It's
you
not
do
far.
that, then the other
I've seen it
ways to
recently.
support us are
You
to
get a lot of green
Patreon.
things. I just need the green thing that I need.
$1 a month.
On it.
Goodies every day with exclusive shows. We are posting all of our notes monthly over to Patreon, so you can see the notes, the scripts, all of those perks also come with the YouTube
Where is
membership.
your lid?
You can get that for just $1 here.
Right.
If
I
every single
tried
person who
this.
subscribed to this channel,
different
honestly, if
type.
every single person who watched this video
That
in the first 24 hours became a $1 Patreon subscriber, we could start doing full-scale documentaries on location tomorrow. If you'd like to do something that will support us while giving you something physical, something material, well, the higher Patreon tiers do that, while YouTube doesn't. But more importantly, you can go to bunkerbranding.com and you can wear the lodge. Right now, I've got the Lit Lodge. This is a redesigned, thicker, antlered version of a shirt we made a couple of years ago. We also have a couple of new designs. Those are the redacted media and the new Lit Lodge logo. They're very pretty. They're very nice. And these things are so comfortable. And they're the printing is all done in the United States. I love this print. You can also drink the lodge by going to tableauroastingco.com and clicking the collaborations link in the
Finally.
menu. There you will
Let's see if the head'll
there
fit.
is a War Lodge coffee called Mount Pocono Perk. You might also see a Stakuyi coffee or a History of Everything coffee
yes,
called
gonna
Delicious
work.
Dark. They're both delicious.
Giant
I
jackalope.
drink mine every day, and I actually have a couple of bags of Stakuyis for when I want to make
Oh,
something.
God, I hope the ones are
it
good.
is really good for making like a mocha. I do always have to add into this little bit. I didn't pick this coffee off the shelf. I worked in an artisan roastery for many years, and I spoke to Matt Moore, the man who owns Tableau, and I said, I want these beans. And he gave me those beans, and now I give you those beans. You can also get more Lodge by going to our other
There we
channels,
go.
of which
See
there
how she
are
fits?
many, like at the Aiden Mattis, where I stream. We also have...
The ears are too floppy. I love this one.
And then
It's for toys online locally that nobody wants anymore. And I do get quite a few. But most of them are just like the plastic, and I need like the soft plushy guys. And I got a whole garbage bag full of the soft plushies. And it was awesome. I've used almost every single one. I'm so happy. I used to go to Salvation Army because my local Salvation Army just throws them out. So they'd put them to the side and I go grab them a couple of times a week. But there's a woman there now, and she's really angry and she hates me, and I don't know her name and I don't know why she hates me. But I don't want to go someplace I'm gonna get screamed at every time I, you know, walk in the door. So I'm not gonna go there anymore. Which is a shame because I got a lot of my vintage like 80s and 90s plushies from there. And I just, it's so stressful going there now. I don't want to do it. So I'm sorry I can't go there anymore. And I feel
For
bad.
me, the medicine
because I
wheel
know everything in that
deals with four
dumpster is
aspects of our
like
health, physical,
still
mental,
good and
emotional,
still
spiritual.
wanted, and it's just, it's a real fucking shame is what it is.
In the story of the Bell Witch, there is an old John Bell, a young John Bell, and a Captain John Bell. But which John Bell is which? I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to War Lodge. Tennessee is home
This is
to
right.
delicious whiskey, great music, and some of the most beautiful mountains you will ever see. But it's also home to a lot of ghost stories. From the Tsul'kalu of Cherokee folklore to the Tree Man of Appalachia, there is no shortage of terrifying legends associated with Tennessee and the surrounding area. One of those stories is the legend of the Bell Witch, which some people have connected to the presence of a possible Native American burial ground on the Bell family property. That would not be particularly difficult to believe or understand, as the area has seen a number of cultures and a number of tragedies occur. In the 16th century, Spaniards encountered people belonging to the Mississippian culture, but within just a couple of centuries, many of them were wiped out by new European diseases. Over the next couple of centuries, the area known today as Middle Tennessee would sort of be viewed as a hunting ground more so than a living space for many of the Native Americans and pioneers of the area. The most powerful of the tribes in the region were the Cherokee, who had territory stretching from Virginia into North Carolina and then westward into Tennessee. And the Cherokee are a bit of a mystery in and of themselves. They speak an Iroquoian language, yet they're considerably further south than any of their cousins. The Iroquois Confederacy, as you may know, inhabited mostly northern Pennsylvania and central upstate New York. Of course, there were other Iroquoian-speaking peoples who inhabited the same general region, but the Cherokee were particularly far south. The leading theory regarding how they got there is that sometime in the distant past they migrated down from the Great Lakes region and ended up in the Appalachians, but there are a small group of scholars who wonder if it was the reverse and the Iroquoian languages had actually developed in the southern Appalachian region. If the former is correct, then they moved into the area previously occupied by the Mississippian mound-building cultures, and in some senses blended with their remnants and also sort of took over their homeland. That culture was on its way out by the 1500s, so the Cherokee coming in makes sense. Their first documented interactions with Europeans were with the English, possibly as early as 1657, but certainly into the 1660s, and within just 5 decades, they would end up allying with the British against the Tuscarora. When the British fought the Yamasee peoples a few years later, initially the Cherokee kind of played both sides, sided with the Yamasee for a bit, but ended the war on the side of the English. And then they joined the English again in yet another war in 1755. They had become quite closely aligned with the English in the first half of the 18th century. They ceded part of what would become South Carolina to that colony in 1721 and signed a formal treaty with the English in 1730. British Army officer Henry Timberlake in 1761 described the Cherokee in the following manner. They were of middle stature, of an olive color, generally painted, and their skins stained with gunpowder, pricked into it in very pretty figures. So he's describing tattoos. They wore their hair shaved or plucked with a small circle left in the center rear of the scalp, and they would wear that long, usually with feathers or beads woven in. He also wrote of a painful procedure in which the ears were split and a metal wire or rod run through them to make the ear larger. I didn't totally understand what he was describing, but it did not sound comfortable. But as the second half of the 18th century came along, the Cherokee's alliance with the English was becoming a little bit more feeble. The French were making inroads, offering trade, military assistance, and generally the same things as the English, if only to get the Cherokee to not fight. And while the Cherokee were a powerful tribe and were willing to go to war against other Native Americans with their English allies, the French were a different beast. This was a logistically and scientifically advanced empire, not a small tribe that had crossed over into their territory. And then, in 1758, a company of Virginia militiamen attacked a Cherokee chieftain, a man named Moytoy of Sitico, in Monroe County, Tennessee. Now, this attack was in response to an alleged horse theft, which, if you've watched any of our other videos that involve the interaction between Americans and Native Americans, you will find that alleged horse theft is a very common reason for violence from both sides. In this case, however, it might have been a legitimate misunderstanding. The Cherokee warband, fighting under Moytoy, was under the impression, had agreed with the English, that they would be getting horses resupplied to them along their way back from fighting the French. The Cherokee as a whole had not gone to war with the French, but a few tribes and bands had done so. What may have happened in this case is that they arrived at one of those forts, and either they were at the wrong fort to get their horses, or the fort hadn't received word that they were supposed to give horses. This resulted in them just taking the horses and then the Virginia militiamen going back to get them, and it started ensuing. This in turn led to a series of retaliatory conflicts known as the Anglo-Cherokee War until 1761. And due to the decentralized nature of the Cherokee Nation government, where you had tribal chieftains who would interact with one another in councils, this was a very scattered and asymmetrical conflict. It wasn't a lot of line-style battles. It wasn't, big armies. These were minor skirmishes. After the French and Indian War, however, the English managed to install a pro-England ruler over the entirety of the Cherokee, based on the treaty that they had created with them in 1730. That had seen the Cherokee recognize King George II as the protector of the Cherokee nation and people, in turn for naming one of the Cherokee chieftains as Emperor of the Cherokee. That first chieftain was Moitoi of Sitico, and while this Emperor of the Cherokee, or First Beloved Man of the King, was not an official Cherokee ruler, he was the person the English would side with if there were internal conflicts within the Cherokee nation, which made him a very powerful.
I'll be back. Soon you'll see. You'll remember it. Here's what she said to me. It's all, whatever will be, will be. Fuck, man. That's horrifying. The severed head of my enemies. Ow. Feels weird back there. Feels like I pulled something. My lower back.
He did it again. Yeah, poor guy. Oh, hello. Welcome back.
I should take the eyes out while I have a moment.
Alumni get preferred rates on home and auto insurance, no matter when you graduated.
Which made him a very powerful man. So it made sense that that person should probably be in the pocket of the English crown. After the war, this title was transferred to a Cherokee chieftain named Atakulakula. Additionally, the Proclamation of 1763 was signed by King George III. And this was a bit of an issue. You see, what the proclamation did was establish the proclamation line, which was a border west of which colonists could not settle. The issue here, the Crown had promised land west of that line to American colonists in exchange for their support during the French and Indian War. So during the war, the Crown had promised those colonists that they could settle lands west of the Appalachians and become rich beyond their wildest dreams and have a future for their families. And meanwhile, the Crown had also promised the Cherokee, hey, nobody's going to settle in your lands, we'll keep you safe. And it did not take long at all for this proclamation line and land promised to the West issue to come to a head. In 1773, soon-to-be legendary Pennsylvania-born pioneer Daniel Boone made his way into the Kentucky Territory. It was not his first trip, but this was the first time that he was trying to establish a legitimate settlement. The Cherokee, as well as several other Native American tribes and nations, saw what was going on here with American colonists coming over the Appalachians to settle in that region as illegal. It was in violation of their treaty with the English Crown. The colonists, on the other hand, had some justification. That land had been sold to them by the Iroquois. Now, the problem with that was the Iroquois were not the Cherokee, and the Cherokee were not the Iroquois, and they did not agree with each other on this. So when Daniel Boone, who was traveling with the party of William Russell, which is not the same William Russell as the one in our Donner Party video, when he came through Kentucky, their party was attacked by a band of Cherokee or Shawnee. They ended up capturing both William Russell and Daniel Boone's sons, torturing them, and then eventually killing them, which did not set things off well for the first settlers into Kentucky. And of all the people whose sons they could have ended up killing, these were probably two of the worst. Obviously, Daniel Boone would go on to become one of the most famous American frontiersmen, and William Russell would eventually become the brother-in-law of Patrick Henry. And this gave him quite a few contacts in the new United States government after the Revolutionary War. And Russell would also distinguish himself in the Revolutionary War, rising to the rank of Brigadier General and fighting at the Battle of Yorktown. Relations did eventually normalize between the Cherokee and the Americans, but only after the brutal Second Cherokee War, in which the American counterattack was so devastating that the Cherokee lost territory deep into Tennessee. After that, the peace agreement was signed at Tellico Blockhouse in 1794, and was followed by a series of other treaties. That first Tellico Blockhouse Treaty in 1794 recognized the previously established established borders between the Cherokee and the United States. The first of the following treaties compensated the Cherokee in exchange for land that had been illegally settled, and then the next 3 were basically outright land purchases. And once these territories were purchased, many of the new settlers to the region were Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. As a result of this, a mixed population of Scottish Highlanders and Cherokee developed, and the two found that they had an odd amount in common in terms of both being screwed over by the English and also just lifestyles. The clan structure, the way that things worked between families and between governments, between the Scottish Highlanders and the Cherokee, were all rather familiar to one another. They weren't identical, they weren't perfectly matched, but it meant that these two groups were able to live in a relative harmony. This was helped by the fact that the Cherokee were considered one of the 5 civilized tribes by the Europeans and the Americans, which were a group that they recognized as bearing more of the traits that Europeans considered civilized than some of the others. So basically, these ones they recognized the way they did things more than the way everyone else did. It's probably the most charitable way to put it. Still, the settler population was growing rapidly, and they needed land to live on. So the government offered the Cherokee land out to the west in Arkansas. Their hope was that the Cherokee would voluntarily relocate, and some did, in fact a large number did, but a significant enough portion stayed behind. For Georgia specifically, this was not enough, though Tennessee and Kentucky also were looking to get some of that Cherokee territory, and Georgia decided that they were just going to keep pushing the issue. And unfortunately, neither the Cherokee's status as one of those 5 civilized tribes, nor their admixture with the Scots would spare them. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, and this began the forced exodus of Native American peoples from what was then American frontier. The Cherokee sued to keep their lands and won support from the National Republican Party, which was an anti-Jackson party, which was a precursor to the modern Republican Party. Ralph Waldo Emerson also lobbied aggressively on behalf of the Cherokee, as did Samuel Worcester. Worcester was known for translating the Bible into the Cherokee language and also helping to establish the first Cherokee language newspaper. The Cherokee were successful in court and in fact did win their case, but Jackson just ignored them and allowed Georgia to do what it wanted, pushing the Cherokee further and further out. With the judicial and the executive branches of the government in conflict, it fell to the legislative to try and find a solution, middle ground, and they eventually did, organizing a sale of Cherokee land. So the U.S. government purchased the territory it wanted in exchange for $4 million in 1830 currency, as well as a large swath of land in Oklahoma. However, Cherokee chieftain John Ross then went to the Senate and petitioned them to not sign this, to not push this through, because it was not signed, it was not voted for by a majority of the Cherokee. It was just a small council of Cherokee chiefs, and he felt that that did not represent the wishes of the wider body. Essentially, he was saying those guys did not have the authority to make this deal, so you cannot ratify this. But the Senate ratified it by a margin of 1 vote. By 1838, the Cherokee still had not left of their own free will, and President Van Buren organized an army of 7,000 soldiers and militia, who were then sent to evict about 16,000 remaining Cherokee. And once they were gone, the settlers could finally come in and stay. They didn't have to worry about conflict.
White people are the worst. One thing done. One half thing done. This will be a half thing. I don't have time. A lot of time.
Once they were gone, the settlers could finally come in and stay. They didn't have to worry about conflict. They didn't have to worry about somebody else bringing illegal claim to their land. It was much easier, not for the Cherokee, but for them. And it was in that old Cherokee hunting territory in Middle Tennessee, specifically Robertson County, outside of the town of Adams, that the Bell family would settle down. And it's possible that all of the trouble that began after that had to do with one Native American burial. Now, of course, the Bell family was getting there a little bit before all of this happened. They arrived in the 1810s. You see, in the decades following the War of 1812, there were a lot of Americans who pushed west into that still only nominally claimed territory, and one of them was the Bells. They, as well as a dozen or 2 other families, decided they were going to put down roots on the Red River right there in Tennessee. Today, this is just north of Nashville. The thing about this spot, however, is that local legend, as well as a couple of books and newspaper articles from the 1800s, suggest that the area is haunted. In fact, they suggest that the Bell family were subjected to a series of torments over the years 1817 to 1820. Now, the first thing you might want to ask is, what kind of people were these? Were they con men? Were they rude? Were they unkind? It's complicated. According to the sources we have, John Bell Sr. was a very kind man. He was a good farm manager. He treated his employees well. It's just that not all of those employees were necessarily working with him because they wanted to. So yes, John Bell is described as a kind and generous man who treats his employees well and works with his hands as much as his mind, but he was also a slave owner, and I have to express that throughout this story, because I'm using Richard Bell, his son, I'm using his account, it paints a very rosy picture of a slave owner, and I understand that that might be jarring, but I have to why I am telling you right now that when you hear praise of John Bell, he was a slave owner, that was the norm for the time, and that's probably why you're not hearing a ton of criticism of him. There were, in fact, a few sections of the work that I decided to leave out because they were not directly important to the story and used some pretty rough language. Now, all of the description of John Bell is not that he was Santa Claus. He was written to be a hard-driving foreman, even with his own children, making sure that there were never idle hands, and that when it was time to work, people were doing their jobs. Richard Bell also made it clear that his father never saw any trouble with the law, and never got himself into debt. He always paid up front for everything. And of course, this would not be difficult, because the Bells were actually making out really well down there in Tennessee. Mrs. Bell, whose name was Lucy, on the other hand, she was more in charge of the children's education and their moral upbringing. When she wasn't running the household, she was making sure the kids were getting good moral instruction from a Christian source. And that good Christian upbringing is important here.
Of course it is.
Because all of this is to kind of say that they weren't the type of family who would have made up that there was a demon or a witch haunting them. There must have been someone in the family, in fact most of the members of the family, who believed that there was really something weird going on, even if there wasn't.
Hello.
And you'll understand why I say even if there wasn't as we get into it, because the degree to which this story is paranormal has often been questioned. It's not that there's nothing about it that seems paranormal.
I'm making a giant jackalope stash bar, stash jar.
Wonder if this is not just a
head comes off.
Story, but also a true crime story. And that story began in 1817.
I get some eyes, but I don't know what the horns are going to be, because they're not done yet. They're getting done, printed, up the line.
Now, this work, Our Family in Trouble, was published a few decades after it was written, and it was believed that it was written in 1846, which of course was a few decades after all of the events transpired. And again, Richard Bell was between 6 and 10 years old during the course of these events. According to him, everything was going really well for the family at this time. His one older brother was studying law, another of his older brothers and one of his older sisters were off, had gotten married and settled down, and he and his siblings, who were still minors, were all just, working on the farm, getting their educations. Everything sounds good about the Bell family. The exact quote from Bell is, "Everything seemed to be going smoothly when our trouble commenced." Now, everything, he would later learn, had not been going smoothly. His father and mother had been experiencing some odd things for a little while, and he only became aware of it. I
should have put more in the head.
And these sounds weren't anything.
I guess I'll just stuff the hole that I just made for the tooth.
Scratching on the exterior walls of the house, knocking sounds at the exterior doors. Certainly a little bit unsettling, but could easily just be somebody playing a prank, somebody harassing you, just trying to bother you. Wasn't necessarily anything paranormal. And then the sound started coming from inside the house.
We traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. You hear me? It's coming from inside the house.
It was 1818 when the full family began to suffer, and what at first sounded like scratching at the bedposts, like rats. One Sunday night in May of that same year, Richard, as well as his brothers John, Drew, and Joel, were awoken by that sound, and the two older boys, John and Drew, got up to kill the rat, only for the sound to stop when they did so. They examined the bedstand and found that, there's no scratch marks or bite marks here. That's weird. So they go get back in bed, rather confused, only for the sound to start up again. Bell claims that this process repeated about a half a dozen times until a little bit after midnight. Despite tearing their room apart over the course of the next few hours, they could not even locate a place where the rat could have entered the room. There was no crack in the wall, no hole, no floorboard that was, freaky enough to get out. There was no way a rat...
Work tomorrow, I don't have time for back pain.
To not have to choose hot, cool, beauty, beast, angel, devil, because you are everything.
You take a new phone, add in special offers on phone plans, multiply the affordability, raises the power of savings, add in more special offers, make them for a limited time, and boom! Back to school deals. Fido. At your side.
Come on, I should have done this when I had the head off.
And then gotten out that quickly. This continued every night for several weeks, and they eventually realized that whenever it stopped in their room, it would start in their sister Elizabeth's room down the hall. They soon realized that the whole family was affected, and that anytime somebody got up to look for it, it would just go into a room where somebody was not up looking for it or still asleep. And then when that person got up, it would go to another room. And it would only stop once everybody in the house was out of bed. If they didn't all get out of bed, then it would continue until between 1 and 3 a.m. and then stop on its own. So the thing about this was, it wasn't just that this was kind of annoying, it was getting worse. The scratching sounds were getting heavier, as if they were more like a dog scratching on something than a rat. So they tore apart every single room in the house, looked through all of their possessions, even just sifting through clothing, making sure there were no animals in it, and there was no rat. On top of all of this, it wasn't just the rat scratching sounds anymore. There were also other new performances, as Richard Bell calls them, every night. The sounds themselves diversified, changing from scratching to choking, lip smacking, stones falling, chains dragging, all sorts of creepy horror movie noises. If this were something that were a story from 10 years ago, I would have said something that really speaker, but considering this is 1818, I'm thinking maybe out of it. At first, all of this was just auditory hallucination, but eventually it started to physically interact with the family.
No, that's
At
not.
first, slowly pulling people's blankets off of them as they slept, and then one night, it started to twist at Richard Bell's hair and then yank. And then it did the same thing to his brother, and then another brother, and then another, and his sister, and his mom. The whole thing. The entire family was confused by
I want that
this,
dark purple. I don't want these lighter ones.
Staying up for the rest of the night to make sure that nothing was in the house with
It's still not the
Now,
match.
starting to physically attack them seems to have been a turning point. Because it was here that they decided to, for the first time, open up to somebody outside of the family about this. They did it in secret because nobody wanted to tell the community in 1818 that there was a demon in the house. That's not great for your reputation. So, they went and told their friends the Johnsons, or the Johnstons, depending on which account you read. James Bell Sr. invited Mr. Johnson and his wife over, and they basically just wanted them to experience what they were experiencing. As well, James Johnson was a gatekeeper in the community, a well-read teacher, and they thought maybe if we have him bless the house and bless our family, it'll help us with whatever's going on here, because they had some inkling that it was paranormal. Johnson led a prayer before dinner, directly addressed the issue at hand, and they all retired to their respective rooms. In most horror movies, this would be the point at which the demon takes a night off and doesn't do anything to anybody, so that everybody else in the community assumes that this family is insane. This, of course, isolate them from their friends and neighbors and make them more vulnerable. The demon already seems to be trying to keep them awake, whatever it is, but they're still not sure that this is an intelligent presence so much as just a malevolent energy. If anyone was expecting to do the typical Hollywood thing and take the night off, you are going to be sorely mistaken, because it threw the kitchen sink at the Johnsons. It showed them every single thing that it had done to the Bells in the time that it had been there, and they were startled, to say the least. And to Johnson, this implied that it was an intelligent force, that it had recognized why he was there, and that the reason it was doing this was to assert its power.
Hello.
So he asked it very directly, "In the name of the Lord, what or who are you? What do you want? And why are you here?" I would like to point out that James Johnson was a better ghost hunter than most people on YouTube. Although really with paranormal stuff, what you want to do is ask yes or no questions, or discreet things like, you know, stuff with numerical answers, which is what they ended up doing. Now, this invocation of the Lord's name and the direct question,
I'm thinking of bow. I don't have the horns. The horns are going to be ready in a week. We should see about a bow.
Returned with even more violence. And that violence was particularly directed at Elizabeth Bell, who also went by Betsy, or it seems that specifically, whatever this thing was, it eventually took to call her that. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. She began to feel as though she was being slapped by invisible hands, that her hair was being yanked. It was becoming very clear that this was more than the Bells could handle on their own. They needed help. After that evening's end, Johnson told Bell that he did believe this was an intelligent entity, that it was supernatural, paranormal, or preternatural in essence, in principle, in function, and that it was entirely beyond his comprehension. As such, he suggested that they tell the broader community because more minds might come to a conclusion more quickly. Bell obliged, and quickly news was spread. Committees were formed, experiments undertaken, faith leaders asked, and a close watch was kept on the family every night. Somebody was there making sure that nothing really, really bad happened to these people. Now, of course, how close that watch was is not entirely clear. It could have been that somebody was camped out outside the house. It could have been that somebody was going to check on him every morning and every night. It could have been that somebody was staying in the house with them. It's really not said which of those it is. Also, the family did have slaves who lived in the home with them, but there aren't a ton of reliable first-hand accounts from those slaves, so there's not much to be said for what they have. Despite all of this, the torment continued, with the entire family continuing to experience the auditory hallucinations, those hair yanks, occasionally the feeling of being slapped, but it was really against Elizabeth that most of this was taken out. This would only happen to her when she was alone, however, so local girls began staying with her. But then they thought of something. Since Elizabeth was the primary victim, maybe if they took her out of the house, it would leave her alone, or maybe it would follow her, and at the very least they would know what was going on. So neighbors were asked to take her in, and most of them jumped at the opportunity. This was a very close-knit community. They were even spiritually all intermingled, despite the fact that most of them came from different Protestant traditions. I think there might have been a couple of Catholics involved as well. They all worshipped together. They would go usually house to house, holding service in one reverend or another's living room, and so religious integration was not an issue in this community because it was, for the most part, Protestant Christians from various denominations who were able to intermingle without much problem. So, of course, when one was in need, they were very quick to oblige. But as it turned out, it was not the house. It was not Elizabeth. It was not John Bell. It was the whole Bell family, because Elizabeth continued to be tormented when she was alone, even outside of the Bell property, and the other weird stuff that was happening to the family continued along as usual. Now, this briefly did cause some to believe that Elizabeth was the cause of the problem, but after some debate, that was ruled to be illogical for a number of reasons, not least of which was that she was not in the Bell household and stuff was still happening. So it all came back to Johnson's initial suggestion that maybe this is an intelligent entity, and they stopped trying to avoid it and began trying to communicate with it. They discovered that when spoken to, the entity would cease for a time and then return even more violent than before. And these developments led to an influx of visitors to the home who wanted to speak to the witch themselves and see what would come of it. They would ask it to tap on the wall, smack its lips, blow out a candle, this and that, and eventually they devised a rudimentary manner of communicating, which was to ask it to, tap on the wall a certain number of times if you asked how many of something there were, or to smack its lips, or to tap something for yes. Interestingly enough, if they asked it a question like, how many cows were in this farmer's barn this morning, it would know the answer and it would get it correct every single time, even when there was ostensibly no reason for it to know the answer. Another development came from outside the house, where farmhands, family members, visitors would have rocks and sticks thrown at them or dropped near them, but they could see nobody around who could have thrown it. Some also reported seeing candles floating through the woods. And at this point, it also began to just smack people across the face, especially when they would try and pull their covers back over them. Now, this was visitors to the home, Bell family members. Elizabeth Bell particularly was just really getting it. But it was more, according to Richard Bell, it was more than just the family that was experiencing this. And eventually, it began to communicate not just in lip smacks or taps on the wall, but in whispered tones. It would very softly speak to people, even if you could only hear it when the room was otherwise completely silent. And as more and more people came to talk to it, it began to get stronger and stronger. It seemed that as more people paid attention to this entity, whatever it was, it grew more powerful. It was able to speak more loudly, more firmly. It was able to be more firm with people when it physically manipulated them. It was just getting stronger. And it wasn't long until whatever the entity was could speak loudly enough that everybody in the room could hear it talking. And while Richard Bell says he does not remember the first sentences it spoke, he does remember the first thing it said that was of note. It finally answered Johnson's initial question, and it said, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but I have been disturbed." And this was allegedly in a feeble yet audible voice this first time. And they tried to get more information out of it, but would say nothing further after that. The next time it spoke anything worth recording, it was talking to John Bell Jr., and it was warning him against taking a trip to North Carolina. He was supposed to be going to check in on a property of his father's, and supposedly the estate sale had been wrapped up for a portion of it, and so he was supposed to go there and get his portion of it and bring it back for his dad. Now, the spirit, the entity, whatever you want to call it, told John Bell Jr. that if he went, not only would he return empty-handed because nothing was actually complete yet, but also there would be a beautiful, wealthy young woman coming to visit, and that he had a chance to court her and possibly win her if he didn't go. John laughed this off, but according to the story, he went, he returned empty-handed, and in the time that he was gone, a beautiful young woman from Virginia who was very wealthy had come through and stayed for a little while, but she had left by the time he returned. Later on, the witch, as it was becoming known, gave them a little bit more information, but really quick, I just want to kind of clarify this.
Maybe a little big, but that's okay.
Witch in Appalachia in the 19th century was not entirely the term we think of today when we think witch. A lot of people think Wicked Witch of the West, or maybe they think, more akin to like Wicca, that kind of thing. But a witch has not just in Appalachia, but all throughout the English-speaking world.
What do you think? Kind of adorable, kind of cute.
A number of different things. It can be
Don't
somebody
have any
who
horns.
with the devil. It can be somebody who there are a number of different
I have
things
these little horns, but
in this sense, it may have
I don't
been
like them.
the
They're
belief
too.
that a witch
I don't like them.
wasn't necessarily a person,
But anyway.
but an entity.
So this one just needs
created
horns.
by a person or an entity haunting a person, or perhaps someone gets involved with the dark arts and accidentally creates a part of their soul that flows around people. Anyway, I want it to be clear that when people say that
1, 2, 3. Not
Direct
bad.
investing has partial shares
Not
now.
bad. What time is it?
Hey everybody! Now I own part of this entertainment corporation.
Own a piece of expensive
Time is
stocks
this?
with partial shares.
Alright,
from
I'm gonna
TD
call it a night.
Investing. TD.
But thank you for stopping by and hanging out while I did some work. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. And I will see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Bye. And the